Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are talking national political news of the day. A lot going on in Congress this week. I mean, stuff happened today that isn't that I will actually discuss at the very end. But one of the main set of hearings has been the banking failure hearings. Started in the Senate up until I think Monday. As of yesterday, and I think maybe even today, the House hearings are continuing, and they're basically twofold: criticizing the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, criticizing their management, but also a lot of criticism of the bank regulators for not doing their jobs to make sure that this type of thing didn't happen. Some of it being attributed by some Democrats to the weakening of Dodd-Frank in 2018, but also a lot of discussion about a change in culture around 2018 that hasn't really reverted back. And that was where they basically in Washington, they were telling regulators to back off and let banks do their thing. Well, they did their thing. Silicon Valley Bank, it's kind of interesting, though. They specialize in a bunch of types of loans, and apparently wineries are really needing those loans, and they're struggling because apparently they can't get the loans they need elsewhere. Also, the charities that Silicon Valley Bank gave away helped the migrant workers. So there are some serious losses here. It's amazing that that was the only bank that could help that way. Was that part of what got the bank into trouble? Well, of course, there's also discussion of the fact that the Fed keeps raising rates, and after a year, it's had almost no effect on inflation, arguably none, because inflation has dropped for other reasons. And yet they keep jacking up the interest rates. And there's a discussion now that the Fed, their job isn't about inflation. Their job is to make sure that the banking system is stable. And if what they're doing to insist in inflation is not keeping the banks stable, then they're not doing their job. Now, there's a lot of talk about whether or not these particular situations are unique to these banks and maybe a few others, but everybody else is doing just fine. But there is a lot of concern. And last week we talked about Elizabeth Warren's absolute war on the Fed, and it's not easing up. But even as of today in the hearings, the House members slammed the regulators, and it was bipartisan. And pretty much nobody is happy with the job that they did. So we have a discussion about whether or not there's adequate banking regulation, whether or not the Fed is doing its job, what it's actually supposed to be doing, rather than veering off into broader economic issues. And when they did this in the 1980s under Paul Volcker. A lot to discuss here. The Senate, but it's interesting that the Senate hearings run by Democrats and the House hearings run by Republicans, they're not all that different in their criticisms. Dave?
Yeah, thanks for that setup. So just for general background, like you said, there were congressional hearings this week about how those collapses at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, how that happened practically overnight. So they were speaking with members of the Federal Reserve, the vice chair, and also the Treasury, and also FDIC. So they were all present. And for context, these were the number 2 and number 3 largest bank failures in U.S. history. So it's not insignificant. They at one point when there was a little bit of, like you said, rolling back of Dodd-Frank, there was talk about how banks of this size really didn't need to be considered systemically important. They're not on that list of those 30 banks that are global systemic banks. But we now realize in hindsight that you don't need to be globally systemically important. You could just be regionally or nationally important. And so, like you said, it was a bipartisan lashing of the questioning, lines of questioning. they were questioning the regulators' competency and saying that they were basically asleep at the wheel. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But I think that the vice chair for supervision at the Federal Reserve, his name's Michael Barr. I think he was the one who I thought his comments stood out the most.
Yeah, because he was agreeing with some of what the congressman was saying.
Yeah, and you said that, like, the Fed is responsible for a lot of things. Stability of the system that we now know, the global system, is one of the things that the Fed puts under its own purview, not just the American system. For folks who are interested, there's a great new Frontline special out there. It's almost 2 hours long, but it moves really fast in small pieces, and it takes us from the crisis in 2008 up to present. And it really is helpful in getting context. I think last week in the when we wrapped up our conversation about the banks, I mentioned it's really important to inform yourselves. If that's one way to do it, I recommend it. It's pretty balanced. But anyway, Vice Chair Barr, he pointed out, and we hadn't heard this before, $42 billion was withdrawn the day before from SVB, right, the day before it was taken over, and another $100 billion were in queue for withdrawal on the day that it was seized that didn't
Which
go
is
through.
Mind-boggling.
Right, exactly that. I mean, we have I think I saw the number was we have like about $7 trillion of deposits total, but so much of that is in the huge banks. But still, it's still a big amount, especially when you compare it to.
I mean, you think about the run in It's a Wonderful Life when the wife could pull out their honeymoon money and fix it. This was a lot bigger run than anything in the Depression.
Yeah, and so we can talk more about it, but one of the other things I think that is pretty clear here is there was a degree of finger pointing, like what went wrong, what happened, and I think that the general tone from the Fed, from Barr himself, the vice chair, was that you first and foremost blame the management of the bank itself. And here's a quote: "The bank waited too long to address its problems, and ironically, the overdue actions it finally took to strengthen its balance sheet sparked the uninsured depositors run that led to the bank's failure. They had inadequate risk management and internal controls." So that's a way to say, hey, look, we are the regulator. The Fed is the regulator. We did make some recommendations to them, but in fact, what ended up happening was that they just didn't do it. So I think there was a little bit more pressure in the House than in the Senate to get some capitulation here, like to some admission. But he did agree. Barr did end up agreeing with Elizabeth Warren's criticism that there would be need for increased regulation. Here's a quote from him: "I anticipate the need to strengthen capital and liquidity standards for firms over $100 billion." So he's like, yeah, we acknowledge that but more importantly, he also, internalized and admitted to some of the criticism from House regulators too about that soft touch approach to regulation I talked about,
right?
Where because the SVB was allowed to ignore the Fed, and in fact, I think its CEO was on the board of the San Francisco Fed at the time and had to step down. So it was like inside baseball, like, yeah, sure, we know you're telling us we're supposed to do this, but we're just going to do what we do. And so Barr said, quote, "I expect that we're going to find that we need to have more of an emphasis on supervisors using the tools they have more promptly and in putting in mitigations in place more promptly when they see problems that the banks are supervising." So this was a way to kind of come clean a little bit by saying, okay, yeah, we know that the bad faith actors here are the people that don't respond to our regulation. This doesn't obviously satisfy Congress members who were really trying to grill them pretty heavily.
Well, they may actually, some of the people in the banks may have to actually pay back some of the money that they were paid. I think the CEO you talked about was, compensated $10 million or something like that. He may have to give a lot of that back at this. Now, that's not going to have any impact on the bank. It's really, a small change. But in terms of, where they go from here, Brad Sherman, Democrat from California, requested a broad survey of banks that are undercapitalized the same way SVP was. His question: are there any banks out there, roughly how many, that have capital of under 5%? If you subtract from their stated capital, their unhedged, unrealized losses on long-term debt. And Grunberg, the chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, said, we'll get back to you on that. We'll get you the numbers and share them with you very quickly. They should have them now. It's been a couple of weeks now. What are they waiting for? And waiting for other banks to fail? I mean, this is a big deal. And undercapitalization has been a problem from the beginning. I mean, I've heard of credit unions that have like 1/3, capital in the bank at any one time. That seems overkill by far, but they do that because they are pride themselves on their stability. At any rate. The question is how they'll get that information. Well, apparently the congressmen all agreed that the FDIC has the authority to demand that information. So we'll see. The bank stocks went down yesterday, but they're up again this time. So I guess they're kind of confident because of the bipartisanship of this that something positive is going to happen.
Real quickly, Eric, one of the things that you mentioned was that, the request was made for that information and they do have the power to get it. But I think one of the comments from that, I forgot actually who made it, but I think it was from the person from the FDIC, from the Treasury, that said you need to subpoena that information. So I thought that was pretty interesting that they didn't want to just come up they didn't want to say, yeah, we'll definitely give it to you. It was like, I think there's a subpoena process in place that you would need to do to get that to us. But we're not going to get to the bottom of all the nuances and subtleties here, but it does call into question the role and importance of confidence of people in this system. So one thing that happened was there was in effect, at the time, Treasury Secretary Yellen said, look, these two banks that the FDIC has taken control of, all that money's good, even the uninsured money. And so people were saying, does that mean all the uninsured money in the whole system? And they said, no, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis between, the Treasury and others that, the FDIC, others that we're going to check in with. But that money's good. So it's a way to just, big picture, put confidence back where it might be lacking. But just one thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that there was people did point to the social media, the role of social media, and how again, I don't need to point out exactly who said it, but there was one actor in Silicon Valley in particular who is credited, maybe accurately, maybe not so much, and we'll see if the subpoenas pull to determine if it's really true, but that he sent around messages to his other investment banker friends and also maybe his personal network, and just kind of that was the sort of catalyst, the ultimate last straw, where they said, okay, well, we're going to pull out. And so that represented 42 billion or so right there, some portion of that was significant enough. So there's that piece of it where the speed at which digital bank runs now have the potential to kind of get ahead of the regulatory process to kind of shore up that confidence. And because let's be clear, like I didn't know I wasn't sure if we were going to get super into it, but the whole idea of fractional reserve banking is that they're going to have about 10% of the money on hand, or be able to protect that money, because the idea is that you're not going to have more than that come out to buy a car or take a vacation or fix their house or whatever. That you're not going to have 9 out of 10 people. You're going to have more like 1 out of 10 people on any given day be able to pull money out. And then overnight, the Fed can make sure the bank has access to that money. Once it goes above that, once there's the run, then the stability is in question. So now you call into the risk is, what if there's a nefarious actor? What if somebody is really trying to target banks? And that's that ... that extends more broadly to a true security risk. So that's why I think the Fed and the Treasury and the FDIC all acted so quickly and with such a broad approach to saying, look, we will make it possible for these folks. And they put in place a couple new lending mechanisms They have already had a few mechanisms in place from the past. The idea is that the Fed can make up money overnight, anytime, any amount, and they're willing to do so as needed because we need banking utility as a utility. We need money. They called money like the blood flow of capitalism or blood flow of the economy, and they're going to keep the blood flowing, and they just need to maintain credibility in their decision making throughout.
Well, and as in terms of the action that is being taken too, as of today, Senator Warren, we talked about, and Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, who many people expected to not even be in the Senate after last fall's election, both introduced bipartisan legislation on Wednesday that is entitled, and I want to read this title. It is not subtle. The Failed Bank Executives Clawback Act of 2023, where they want to pull some of that money back. And and I just want to read Elizabeth Warren's a portion of her comments as she introduced the bill. Americans are sick and tired of fat cat bankers paying themselves handsomely while risking other people's hard-earned money. It's time for Congress to step up and strengthen the laws so bank executives bear the cost of failure and not line their pocket and walk away scot-free. So anyway, there's going to be plenty more to say about this. We'll see if this passes, and we'll see if it is deemed constitutional when it passes. But definitely a lot going on here, and a lot of politics, but not the usual type of politics, rare bipartisanship.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Well, last week there were other hearings held in the House and Senate, I believe. Let me start over there. Let me find out to be sure.
I think it was in the House, the Commerce Committee.
In the House, and there it is. House
Energy and Commerce Committee. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Well, last week there were other hearings held in the House Committee for Energy and Commerce about TikTok. Of course, that is the very popular, especially with young people, but with a lot of people, of short videos. It's got a unique approach to the social media, but it's coming under fire because people are saying that there is at least the potential for spying. Because it is owned by a Chinese company, which may or may not be heavily influenced by the Chinese government. And so there were a lot of questions asked. A lot of techies are making fun of some of the questions asked. They said that, boy, this was about the lowest tech IQ I've heard in a long time, because there were some really dumb questions apparently. But it is a serious movement, and it seems to be somewhat bipartisan. Now there are Democrats who are supporting it, but it's dividing the Republican Party. For instance, Hawley, who is somebody who believes very much that TikTok ought to be banned in the United States, whether or not that's even feasible or constitutionally or otherwise. He wanted to rush it, do a rush passing through the bill. It was blocked by alleged libertarian Senator Rand Paul, who actually, in a rare moment, has lived up to his designation as a libertarian, and he's basically telling Republicans, we're going to be tagged with this politically if we ban TikTok. Yes, some Democrats are involved, but we will be blamed. And so there's a fight there. But of course, some Democrats support it too, particularly if they're hawks. But And I guess the TikTok people, Xiao Chu, his responses were not satisfying. It was notable that the Chinese government probably made a political mistake there, decided to comment. No, we don't have anything to do with that. Why would you bother to comment on it then if you don't have anything to do with it? Well, maybe because you want the Chinese-based company to flourish. I guess you can come up with other motives, but they should have just stayed shut up because that didn't help at all. So, and the question is, how do you even ban something this big and keep it out? Is it legally feasible? And what are they actually talking about? And how is it be specifically as to how it's a national security threat? Only 39% of those younger than 30 support a TikTok ban. Both parties have to be cognizant of that. Dave, you probably have a lot more knowledge than I do on this.
Well, I really appreciate the setup as always. So this is a complicated issue, and it's one of those things where, like in the Venn diagram of life, TikTok is a really, really tiny percentage of what they're actually trying to pass. So I think that's part of why putting the brakes on it is actually a service to the nation, to the citizenry, to reflect and consider what Congress is just tried to railroad through in the name of being anti-TikTok. So let's take a half step back and talk about what this was. Like you said, TikTok has been under congressional scrutiny for a long time because it's owned by Chinese firm ByteDance, and the laws in China require ByteDance to make user data available to the ruling Communist Party. So there's been all sorts of machinations around this. For example, TikTok saying, well, our servers are in the U.S. It's sequestered. We're complying with all U.S. rules. We're just doing what the other, social media companies are doing and nothing more. There's no like unique Chinese threat, which is disingenuous, of course, because there is a unique Chinese threat. But it's also accurate in the sense that they are doing what every other social media company is doing, which is risky to privacy and risky to children. So there's a national conversation that should happen about that, but we're focusing on the overlapping Venn diagram here, just on the TikTok portion. So the committee really they framed the whole session, a 5-hour interrogation of the CEO, Xu Chu, like you said. He's a 40-year-old former Goldman Sachs banker who unfortunately has had the responsibility of standing in for all of our country's criticisms and fears of China's, and rightly so, but China's authoritarian communist rulers. So there's a lot of things that need to be addressed, between the United States and China. But let's talk about what TikTok is, right? Like what's its presence? So it's about 80 million monthly active users in the United States. The average user spends an hour and a half, 95 minutes per day. The average user opens it up 8 times a day. And if you look at the bell curve, which is 85% of all people fall in the middle, with outlier 7.5% on each end. When it comes to TikTok, 83% of users post videos. So about the vast majority of users, the bulk of it, are people communicating visually multiple times per day for a significant amount of time per day. And when you look at the age distribution, it's about 25% 10 to 19-year-old. So that's a quarter, right? That is 20 million children aged 10 to 17 plus 18 to 19-year-olds. 20 million of them are on average 8 times a day, an hour and a half a day. 48%, just under 48% of users are under 30. So that's 40 million young people total, according to demographics. And then it goes lower and lower as you get older. The group 50 and up is only about 11%. So there's different metrics out there. But the idea is that it's really, that's why the fear, so to speak, is that children are the main consumers. And that the argument is made that the security risk, because you'd rattled off a bunch of questions. One of the security risk questions was, well, if China decided to harmonize their messaging or their influence campaign, et cetera, then they would have the capacity to influence huge swaths of American youth at one shot. And the unstated premise here is that because of the artificial intelligence and algorithms that their insights are beyond sort of what we're able to understand as our society is not keeping up with how fast things are changing. So you could get predictive capacity out of a computer if you're an authoritarian that says, hey, favor this message, influence that message. And so that's the real fear. So not to sort of steamroll here, but I want to add one last thing. You did reference that there was a bill that was passed or that was proposed, sponsored by Senator Mark Warner, sweeping new powers, and it was held up. It's called the Restrict Act. It's called Restricting the Emergence of Security Threats That Risk Information and Communications Technology Act. And so I found a site that I looked through Wired magazine the other night to see a little bit about what they had to say about it. But there's a few other tech sites out there, and I found one that was basically boiled it down to it's essentially government nationalization of the internet, and it goes after everything that contributes to individual people's freedom and safety online. And then I actually read through some of the bill, and a couple key takeaways from one page and then another page. In the defining, who this bill is targeting, it empowers the Secretary of Commerce to declare harmful actors as foreign adversaries, quote, and it lists China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. So this is not a TikTok bill. Mm-hmm. This is a bill designed to target all of those foreign adversaries and anyone else that the Commerce Secretary decides. And how do they decide? From a different page. The Secretary of Commerce gets to define an unacceptable risk. So any country that has any entity that owns one share or one interest, one penny of interest in any company, any entity in the world, defines unacceptable risk by giving examples: sabotage, subversion, intervention, interference, coercion. And then at the end, they add any action deemed an unacceptable risk. So that's open-ended. And then, just so you know, the Patriot Act is all over this thing. It references the Patriot Act. So this is tying the war on terror and the post 9/11 security state to the internet almost without limit.
Yeah. Now, as I discussed earlier, part of the problem is that lawmakers some of them were in over their heads, and there's been a lot of mocking of them on the internet. U.S. Representative Richard Hudson represents North Carolina's 9th District, says, so if I have a TikTok app on my phone and my phone is on my home Wi-Fi network, does TikTok access that network? And somebody mocked him saying, gee, does TikTok access my battery to steal my electricity? It's just, I mean, it was, and then in another one, they're just like making fun of all of the congressmen. What color is the algorithm? Christian Devine and, users said they're making fun of them. And so there isn't a whole lot of confidence in the public that even if they're going to pass, that they know what they're doing. I mean, and do they have experts to do that? Well, why aren't they bringing those experts into the hearings to say, here's what we can do, and this is more realistic than this, but they're not taking any of that testimony right now, probably because they don't want to be looking like idiots because they don't know what kind of questions to ask, even if they can get like their 15-year-old children to maybe prompt them with some intelligent questions. The problem is, and TikTok, they have proposed some type of system. I don't know exactly what it is, but it involves Oracle as an oversight. Looking at where codes are coming from and the rest. It's a very complicated problem. Is there a serious national security risk? Well, if they've been airing the opinions of experts, if they've been taking that kind of testimony, they're not airing it. That's more important than bringing Mr. Chu in to drag him through the mud. I want to hear from experts saying it's a security risk and this is why, and these are the steps we can take to do it. I mean, it's just because, but what they're hoping is, Chinese ban, yes, security, yeah, the flu came from there, everything else, and they're hoping that simplicity is going to help them out, but it will not help out. Rand Paul is right. This could really hurt the Republicans, and it probably won't pass through the Senate anyway. At this point, I don't know, maybe, but I just don't know that there are enough Democrats and Republicans to do this if they don't have Rand Paul and who else. I mean, Josh Hawley, nobody wants to be associated with his stuff anyway because he's so far gone. But the real issue that Congress has is, do people out there with any type of tech education, and I'm not one of those people, do they feel confident that they can pass even an effective law on this?
Yeah, and so from what I've seen, I'll focus on one voice that was out there that I think is really important. I mentioned, and we could pick this up in the future maybe, but Wired. It used to be called Wired Magazine, but it's not. It's online now, so I think it's just Wired. But so Del Cameron wrote an article called "The TikTok Hearing Revealed That Congress is the Problem." So realistically, some of the elements there. I'll give you a quote. The hearings were a success in one way. It revealed over 5 hours how desperately the United States needs national data privacy protections and how lawmakers believe somehow that taking swipes at China is a suitable alternative. So that's kind of where we are, that when we talk about TikTok, what we're not talking about is privacy. We're not talking about the existing legislation that's already been proposed. There's national privacy law template language out there. California has a privacy law. So we could start by looking at the California law as something that initiates some credible pushback.
Yeah, but that law is complicated and not even sure it's going to work. We passed it. It was like one of the most convoluted propositions I've ever tried to read. And it wasn't even just the tech stuff I didn't understand. I didn't understand what the proposition was attempting to accomplish even. It was really that complicated. So I don't know that they're going to look at that unless it's been effective but sometimes implementation of something, even if a law is badly written, could be effective, and maybe they just figure, I got a pretty wide framework here because the law is so vague, at any rate, we'll see. So I think they'd have to look more at the implementation, but I don't know anything about that either.
Yeah, the European code is something much more robust that companies, global corporations, any economic entity around the world that operates in Europe already has digital privacy programs in place because of the robustness of the EU solution. So that's one avenue. But at this point, we're still trying to get people to pay attention, and I think that this hearing kind of one of the takeaways that Del Cameron said in Wired was there's two key issues here: passing a national privacy law that limits the data that companies can collect, but that's a really small lift compared to navigating the legal minefield around content moderation enforcement. So that's a quote from Wired. But what it shows is that if you're fearful of propaganda, if you're fearful of the things that I mentioned, influence, coercion, then that's content moderation. We already have that problem that we are really not addressing in the United States. And we saw that around the last election, where depending on your political point of view, you'd think that your side or the other side has engaged in disingenuous or harmful online activity, and that the tech companies really aren't doing a good job of self-regulation, and there's a relatively regulation-free environment here. But there was one Florida Congresswoman, Kathy Castor, which I highlighted this. I thought it was really important to point this out. She pointed out basically a call to action. And here's a quote from her. She said, "From surveillance, tracking, personal data gathering, and addictive algorithmic operations that serve up harmful content and have a corrosive effect on kids' mental and physical well-being, Americans deserve protection no matter the source."
Sure.
In other words, she's saying it's not just TikTok. And one last quote from her. She said, "There are other malign actors across the world who gather data, who use it as an element of social control, influence peddling, and worse. big tech platforms profit immensely from keeping children addicted. They are the modern day tobacco and cigarette companies. So it's really like the elephant in the room. The vast majority of the stuff we're not talking about is because of the tech sector in the U.S. really doing an effective job at looking after its own interests and kind of keeping this off the agenda. So yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah, it doesn't. On the upside, it doesn't cause emphysema or lung cancer, but that's a little melodramatic, I think. But
suicide and gun violence.
That's true. It's true. Is that the cause, though?
Drug addiction.
40 years ago, we blamed heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons. So, it's just to say that those are necessarily caused by TikTok, I don't know. But the problem is that we probably really need to not conflate the two issues, national security and what's good for the children. Even if there's some overlap in what the the solution might be, and there's been a backlash against Congress on this. It seems clear that much of America did not experience the hearing the same way many political insiders and reporters did. Somebody named Brooke Oberwetter, spokesperson for TikTok, Shao came prepared to answer questions about national security, data privacy, and the safety of teens who use our service, but instead was met with interruptions and yes/no questions as he tried to set the record straight. So this is the response. This is TikTok's response, and overwhelming support from people. It's really important that Congress people know what they're talking about when they do this kind of stuff. Everybody thought that he was amazing. Not everybody, but a lot of people, a lot of Gen Z activists. And so we really, again, Congress needs to know what it's talking about. They need to either learn it, or maybe they don't ask the questions. Maybe they've got people in their staff who understand it more, and maybe they should let their staff ask the questions. This is done. There is actually precedent for that. Where you can actually have somebody in to ask the questions for you. It was done during the Iran-Contra hearing, for instance. So, there's a lot of ways to go about it, but that means they don't get to grandstand. So, anyway, I'll let you have the last word.
One other element here that I think is pretty important is that when it comes to AI, China, just by the size of their market and not domestic and their regional Southeast Asian market, they're able to just get a larger number of people that they're able to analyze and make predictive behavior questions about. So that's an AI platform that they can then extend into the U.S. It just gives them an even greater competitive advantage than they already have, and I think that's a national security risk. That's the unstated premise here of why they're so concerned about TikTok in particular.
Final topic of the night, Iraq War authorization. We have this is actually something that I really take objection to. Congress has, over the past 100 years or so, has basically delegated its authority to declare war to the executive. I think this is problematic. You rarely even get a declaration of war, but there you've had the War Powers Act and the rest, and basically they pass a law that says the president can do this without our oversight, essentially. I mean, they're not oversight, but without our permission, because normally Congress is supposed to declare war. And we don't have a legal definition of war. In the past, they've used it to call it police actions or rescue missions and the rest. But as a response to 9/11 in 2001, the president was given broad discretion with regard to Afghanistan, and then again with regard to the Iraq War, based on what we now know are lies about alleged weapons of mass destruction. Where Colin Powell, I know some leftists like to tout him, but he went in. He said he knew he was lying. He went in to the room, covered up the Guernica painting that is at the UN thing, because nobody wants to think about anti-war in a minute like that, and he just told lie after lie after lie. And then I remember the American press, and I'm not even talking about Fox News, I'm talking about CNN, when when people were asking questions, this, I can't remember her name, but she says, didn't they listen to Colin Powell? And so this is the American press fawning over Colin Powell, while the rest of the world's media was already taking his positions apart. It was really a shameful moment. And so the war, that particular delegation of authority, the war authorization has gone on. Even though the war is, I won't say over in Iraq, that mission was, and it's got, and the defenders of this are saying, well, it's necessary to protect Iraq and the gains it's made. Well, that's a different mission. So maybe you need a totally different authority, but maybe Congress shouldn't even be granting this kind of authority. Anyways, they want to dial it back and reclaim, have Congress end the Iraq War authorization, but some people are opposing it. It's coming up in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell is saying it's a big mistake. We need to maintain this thing. I mean, permanently. I mean, it's like they want to rewrite the Constitution to basically give the president the authority to declare war. And a lot of Beltway insiders are very critical of this, but it is up in the Senate. I don't know that it's going to come up in the House, because McCarthy has said that he opposes revoking that authority. It shouldn't take. It should, if they grant the authority, it should be on a temporary basis where it sunsets automatically, and you require congressional action to extend it. They shouldn't be in a position here where they have to get a majority of both branches of Congress to take away this authority. Dave.
Yeah. So today the Senate did vote to repeal the authorization for use of military force granted in 2002 to former President George Bush as one of the key elements of the legal architecture of the post 9/11 global war on terror that we've been engaged in ever since. The bill passed 66-30 with bipartisan support.
Wow.
It got pushed to me like minutes before we talked. I should have mentioned it, but I didn't mention it. I'm sorry. But this is, it comes just 1 week after the 20th anniversary of the U.S. ground invasion of Iraq, so this is the first time since the 70s that the Senate has voted to revoke an authorization for presidential use of force. And so people say, oh, this is so old, it's archaic, it's not in use. But in reality, as a reminder, the 2002 authorization use of military force was cited by the Trump administration as legal justification for the 2020 U.S. strike that assassinated Iranian General Soleimani, who was commander of the Quds Force, which is one of the 5 branches of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. He was at the time considered the number 2 most powerful person in Iran, subordinate to Khomeini, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei at the time. So it's something that is still in part of our engagement on a military/legal basis. But I wanted to point this out because I don't think very many people know this, that the bill does not repeal the authorization of military force passed in 2001. Which the Brennan Center for Justice said has been stretched far beyond its original intent. Much of it is classified, so much of Congress doesn't know what we're doing. Most American citizenry don't know what we're doing.
So no oversight.
Right.
I mean, this is scary.
Yeah, but it does include, military actions in Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Syria. It's what authorizes the prison at Guantanamo Bay, as well as any of the other black sites that we kind of forgot about since we're no longer in hot war, but they existed in countries all over the world. We had these sites like Guantanamo, and not to bring up old wounds, but there has been talk again surfacing because it was 20 years ago. Some of the actions and decisions made on, they are borderline suspect and things that were done. There's a film about it called the Blank Report, and it was called basically the blank part was the torture part.
Yeah.
So we do have a dark part of our history that is authorized under this legal regime. And I'll just mention this. A couple comments from senators. Senator Tim Kaine said, finally, the Senate voted to formally end the decades-long Gulf and Iraq wars. Proud to lead the bill to get this done. Our troops served courageously. The mission's over, and the war authorizations against Iraq are now outdated and unnecessary. It's time to repeal them. And that's true, right? So we do need to end the Iraq war. We do need to end the Gulf War. Senator Bob Menendez says something similar. It's a recognition that Congress has not only has the power to declare war, but should have the responsibility to end war. And Senator Mitch McConnell, on the other hand, said, Tehran wants to push us out of Iraq and Syria. Why should Congress make that easier? So they still are. There is still the sense in Congress that maybe we ought not end the Iraq war portion of our War Authorization Act, authorization for use of military force. So it's not 100% that it's going to make it through the House. So we could talk about that in a little bit.
I mean, I don't even know that these war authorizations are necessary, at least under the interpretation of the law, because Carter, even after the Vietnam War Powers Act was revoked, Carter, Reagan, Clinton all bombed people, without this authority, in Lebanon, in elsewhere. They do have if there is an impending security risk, they or whatever, or they make that determination, and nobody in Congress ever challenges them. And when they do something like Iran-Contra, they get away with it because most of the public just doesn't hold politicians accountable. So, but it does look like they've made attempts to at least change the 2001 authorizations to put some kind of limitations on it. But you got McConnell in the way, you got probably McCarthy in the way. The only hope is if there are enough, crazy isolationist conservatives in the House to move this along. I don't know exactly, and it's regional too. It's not even limited to a country. It's regional because, of course, terror is regional. But there are terrorists in Europe. Do we have authority to bomb people in Europe? No. And Yemen is an ongoing thing. I mean, I don't know how many people we've killed with bombings and drones in Yemen. It doesn't stop, and it hasn't stopped. It went right through the Obama years and into Trump, and I believe Biden's still doing it. I don't know, exactly how much or if he slowed it down. He did promise to slow it down. Anyway.
So I was going to say, Vice President Kamala Harris was just, or maybe still, is on tour in Africa, and one of the first places they publicized she stopped was Niger, and that's a big drone base there. So. The West Africa war on terror is linked through Al Qaeda and other, networks that are covered under the 2001 Act. So we do have a global presence based on the 01 Act. But so as far as in the House goes, I think twice the Democrats have passed, with Democratic leadership, twice the House has passed this repeal of the 02 authorization with bipartisan support. Like you said, there are sort of America First type or keep the boys home sentiment that's strong in the Republican Party. It's not so much isolationist necessarily, but it's like, look, how long do we need to be there? What's the purpose of being there? And if we shouldn't be there, then we should do something different. And I think that's a bipartisan sentiment. So Kevin McCarthy did say the bill could make it out of committee for consideration and debate. But again, I think that this is just a little more complicated than people understand. Ending to the Iraq authorization isn't ending the global authorization. So we still have a global war on terror with, classified limits, if any. But I have one other sort of angle on this, which is a recent longitudinal study showed that America's sense of patriotism is really at a low in recorded history. As recently as 1998, before 2001, 70% of people surveyed in these studies have said, they have a positive patriotic sentiment. So very strong, and then there's the middle, and then there's the weak and very weak, right? So when the question is who has the positive, that's declined from 1998. Now the most recent data is just 38% positive. So we are now in a situation where a vast majority of people are not positive about that patriotic sentiment. And when you drill down, it is bipartisan. And so what does that mean? It's a lack of confidence in the government overall. And so no matter who you are, no matter where you fit on the political spectrum, everyone has a set of issues that affects them personally that they want to be critical of. But generally speaking, I want to focus back on Iraq, the Iraq War. The cost and corruption of, or the Afghanistan War for that matter, the cost and corruption of forever wars, past and present, conducted by presidents from both parties, has been a significant national traumatic experience. So right now, we're arguably trending towards or in the midst of another very costly global confrontation and starting to see some loss of public support. So I think this is why they're acting. This is why Congress is acting. It seems like the right time for them to address at least a part of this issue that has sat with us for this 20 years. Yeah,
and there's if it does get onto the floor in the House, it does have a chance to pass. So they may revoke the 2002, and that's a blanket revocation. So there doesn't have to be a reconciliation meeting between the House and Senate. But any attempt to roll back even portions of the 2001 legislation is going to be more difficult and problematic, and it's going to require some real serious discussions as to what they want to revoke and what they don't want to revoke. But my feeling is, if you feel this strongly about it, McConnell and other Beltway insiders who are hawks, you should push for a constitutional amendment then to see that gives the executive this power. I'm going to end on that, but we will obviously continue to have this discussion. We'll see what happens in the House. That brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
So this week, I'm pointing out that over the weekend, former Republican Governor Chris Christie attended a town hall at St. Anne Salem's College in New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and then he went to a private event with friends, supporters, and people associated with his run for presidency in 2016. Multiple sources have reported that he took aim squarely at former President Donald Trump, blaming him for the Republican Party's losses in recent elections and saying he's led the party down a, quote, down a sinkhole of anger and retribution. And he also made the assertion that he is the best person to confront and defeat Trump in the political arena. And I'd say these statements are consistent with things he's been saying publicly for a while now, but with an added dose of animosity. So, for example, he said the only person he cares about is him. And if we haven't learned since Election Day of 2020 to today, then we're not paying attention. That's a quote from Chris Christie. So he's going head on. He also said he'd decide in the next 45 to 60 days if he's going to run for president. And so I say that when your timeline is expressed in days, I think this indicates he's very seriously considering a run. My prediction is that this former U.S. attorney will back up his rhetoric and will, in fact, declare his candidacy for president in the very near future. Okay.
Well, I'll be real quick here. There was another hearing today in Senator Bernie Sanders, he is the head of the Labor Committee, and he had in Howard Schultz, who is the head of Starbucks, and he was very strong. Over the past, well, this I'll just quote Sanders. Over the past 18 months, Starbucks has waged the most aggressive and illegal union-busting campaign in the modern history of our country. The fundamental issue we are facing today is whether or not we have a system of justice that applies to all, or whether billionaires and large corporations can break the law with impunity. Schultz took that very personally, said he never broke the law, doesn't like being called a billionaire, even though he owns billions of dollars. I don't know why he objects to that, but he says, he hasn't broken the law. There was some mocking from the gallery, and this is exactly what we talked about a couple months ago. Bernie Sanders is using this as a bullhorn, and my prediction is that in the future, they are not going to, the CEOs he calls in are not going to come voluntarily and will probably resist subpoenas to come in because they do not want to face Bernie Sanders. And anyways, so that is the national political news of the day. We'll be back next week. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.